sociologist Jacques Ellul simultaneously wrote 2 books on violence and revolution. Written together, but really read together, if at all, Autopsy of Revolution 1969 and Violence, Reflections from a Christian Perspective, also 1969, form Ellul's major contribution to non-violent revolutionary thought. Ellul wrote of revolution and Christian non-violence at the height of historical interest in revolutionary thinking in the last 200 years, in the 1960s. And if you put in revolution into Google Books and see there's some sort of data thing which analyses the use of words in different books, the 1960s, especially the late 1960s, was the height of revolutionary thinking in the world, at least according to publishing around revolution. And in that period, 1960s, it was a revolutionary period in which many shibboleths of the Western world were being overturned, and the decolonisation of the South was being hurried along by revolutionary movements of the colonised. It would be unfair to suggest, however, that Ellul's works in the 1960s and 70s on these topics was Ellul simply jumping on the bandwagon of revolutionary thinking. Ellul's interest in revolution existed throughout his career, from an early article on Christianity and revolution in 1936 to one of his most important works, The Presence of the Kingdom, in 1948, and remained a theme throughout his life. In fact, much of Ellul's writings about revolution was lamenting the involvement of Christians in worldly revolutions. And this was part of an ongoing criticism of Christians not marking a distinction between the world and the kingdom, which Christians must witness to in a different way. In this paper, I'll provide an outline of Ellul's non-violent Christian revolution and evaluate its relevance to today's political situation. Jacques Ellul was born in 1912 in Bordeaux, France. After studying law, he spent most of his career working as a professor at the University of Bordeaux. His provincial location was one reason he was never part of the Parisian intellectual establishment, and he remained an independent thinker, never following French intellectual fashions. He died in 1994. He wrote hundreds of books and articles in the fields of law, theology, history, politics, sociology, and biblical studies. And even though Ellul was a professional legal historian, he divided many of his books into 2 broad divisions, being sociological studies and theological studies. As a young man, Ellul was a committed Marxist and claimed to have read all of Karl Marx's works. Never fully rejected, his Marxism was moderated by his conversion to the Christian faith. Other key influences on Ellul were Kierkegaard and Karl Barth. However, Ellul was never an uncritical Barthian, and in the end, Ellul was more of a prophet and Barth more of a systematician. Ellul criticised Barth for his lack of realism concerning social conditions, accusing Barth of not understanding politics. In fact, it was Barth's justifying the state that led to Ellul moving beyond Barth, not only in politics, but also in pursuing studies of art and technology. It is for his writings on technology that Ellul is most famous. His first book on the subject, The Technological Society, which first appeared in French in 1954, with an English translation in 1964, remains his best-known work. As Ellul saw it, we're living in a new milieu, the age of technology, or as he saw it, the technological environment. And sometimes characterised as a technophobe, Ellul was not opposed to technology as such. He believed that the modern world is developing a new worldview that shapes our approach to politics, law, religion, and human relations in general. This age is not only an age in which various technologies are prized, such as cars and guns, it is also an era of technique in which we seek the one best, rational, efficient way to do everything. Politics was another major theme of Ellul's work. His interest in politics came apart from his brief post-war role as Deputy Mayor of Bordeaux, where his experience of the relationship between elected officials and bureaucrats shaped his views of the modern state. And of his several works on politics, his most important was The Political Illusion, which investigates politics in our technical age and the politicisation of society. In Propaganda, the formation of men's attitude, Ellul investigated techniques used to manipulate individuals and mass opinion. Propaganda, he found, is now a necessary technique in our modern world of technique, even in free democracies. In part, Ellul based his critique of propaganda on his experience of attending, out of curiosity, a Nazi rally in Nuremberg in the 1930s. There he saw separate persons united into a mass within which individual thought became almost impossible. Now, my first question to put to Ellul is whether his analysis of the world from 50 years ago has any relevance to the 21st century. And it's only if his analysis is somewhat applicable to our world that his revolutionary proposals will also be applicable. And many of the features of his world remain factors in ours: violence, war, poverty, propaganda, imperialism, capitalism, and the mass society, which suppresses the individual personality and subsumes it into a homogeneous, bland society where our freedom is under constant threat. Ellul believed that the universal catastrophes of the present time are not due to accident or bad luck, nor are they mere breakdowns in the happy mechanism of progress. They are the inevitable product of the essential structure of our civilization. For this reason, Ellul suggests that the remedies cannot be found within the current structures of society. It is therefore pointless to look to the state as a tool which can change our predicaments. The state will be only too glad to take more power to conform us to the needs of itself and capital and technique. Now, when these words were written in 1951, Ellul admitted that it appeared as if he was living in revolutionary times. There was disorder, violence, progress in technological developments and political goings-on. But in reality, Ellul writes, our world is standing still because its framework remains absolutely fixed. It is this framework which, in the presence of the kingdom, his book, he describes as the primacy of production, the continual growth of the power of the state, and the formation of the national state, the autonomous development of techniques, etc. For Ellul, then we need to think at the level of the underlying structure of society, and he developed this under the influence of Marx. Ellul wished to ask, what question would Marx have investigated if he was alive in 1940? And Ellul settled on the topic of technology. And in a series of books, Ellul analysed the emerging technological society and its effects on the rest of society. In brief, Ellul says we are developing a new technological age to which everything must succumb. And this produces a diminished humanity in which humans become slaves to technology and its required efficiency. What is required is a revolution to liberate humanity from the tyranny of the rule of technique. Now, what does this revolution look like? What are its means, and what does the new society look like? Now, before discussing Ellul's revolutionary thought, I just want to touch on what he thinks about violence and his claim that violence can form no part of any revolution. In his book Violence, Ellul outlines 5 laws of violence which characterise violence rather than defining it, but these 5 laws form a summary of his teaching on violence. Law 1 is continuity. Once you start using violence, you cannot get away from it. Law number 2 is reciprocity, and that's stated in Jesus' famous words, all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Law 3 is sameness. And to quote Ellul, "Here I shall say only that it is impossible to distinguish between justified and unjustified violence, between violence that enslaves." Law 4 is reproduction. Violence begets violence and nothing else. This is the fourth law of violence. Violence is par excellence the method of falsehood. And law 5 is justification. The fifth law of violence is this: the man who uses violence always tries to justify both it and himself. Now, through these laws of violence, Ellul issues a warning to the revolutionary and the politician alike. You think you can control violence, but in the end, violence will control you. Why is this? Violence, according to these laws, has its own empirically verifiable pattern. Violence cannot be stopped when we want it to be stopped. Those who take up violence can and will have violence used against them too. From an objective viewpoint, violence looks the same whether it is the violence of the pirate or the emperor, recalling the famous story in Augustine's City of God. And typically we try to justify violence, and why is that? Because we know that violence does not justify itself. Because we know violence is wrong, we have to justify it. Hence we have just war theory. Finally, violence to Ellul is in the order of necessity. This is why violence cannot be used by Christians. Ellul said, "For the role of the Christian in society in the midst of men is to shatter fertilities and necessities, and he cannot fulfill this role by using violent means, simply because violence is of the order of necessity. To use violence is to be of the world." And for Ellul, Christians are not of the world. We cannot use violence. Now, there's a scholarly debate here over what Ellul means by necessity. And I think here he means that necessities are of the order of the fall and human sin, which Christians can recognise but must not accept and should work against. And it has to be admitted that here Ellul is not as precise here on necessity as we would like him to be. And I could go on about that for another half an hour, but I'll just jump ahead. In summary, Ellul is against violence and believes that Christianity teaches meekness and non-power, which follows the example of Jesus' own ethics in never using power to his own advantage and in rejecting violence and political power. And in doing so, Ellul wrote that Jesus became one of the most important shapers of human history. Ellul's writing on revolution are wide-ranging. He begins Autopsy of Revolution by distinguishing between a revolt and a revolution, with a revolt being a spontaneous reaction against injustice without a thought-through plan. Revolution, on the other hand, must have a plan and a desire to see it through to the end. He goes on to describe how Marxism has distorted our understanding of revolution by assuming that all revolutions have a social origin and making it inevitable and in line with historical development. So in other words, the revolution is inevitable, the contradictions of capitalism will bring about a revolution eventually, and so on. Despite his different account of revolution, every revolutionary would agree with Ellul that it is the heart of the problem that must be attacked. Not many of them would agree with Ellul's next sentence that, and Christians alone can do that. This is because for Ellul, the heart of many of the world's problems are not simply physical realities, but the spiritual forces that manifest themselves in these physical realities. Non-Christians cannot and will not accept this, and nor will those demythologized Christians who, as followers of Rudolf Bultmann, no longer believe in spiritual beings. Of course, the non-Christian revolutionary can point to their success and claim that Ellul is going too far, but Ellul is not impressed with superficial changes. If we contend against the state or social injustice only on the human level, we shall of course bring about some apparent changes, but the basis will remain untouched and nothing decisive for humanity will be gained. In Autopsy of Revolution, Ellul writes of the necessary revolution that must strike at the roots of the technological society, the state, and propaganda. Ellul's necessary revolution is that revolution for which there is a moral imperative in this world, a revolution that must be made. And the basic direction of this revolution is against the direction of the impersonal technological world we live in. And there are two conditions for this revolution. First, man must sense to some degree that he cannot endure life as it is, even though he may not be able to explain why. Secondly, the basic social structures must be blocked. That is incapable of acting to satisfy expressed needs or of providing access to that satisfaction. And both conditions here are subjective. Too often the first criteria is met, but on the second one, people feel that reform can alleviate the suffering of the people. State and corporate propaganda assures us that the system of oppression can correct itself and give us our freedom. This necessary revolution must be made by people, must be planned, it requires a plan, and individuals working together to change the conditions of our life. For Ellul, it strikes in the direction of personalism and situationism. Where can this revolution take place? Ellul, as a contextual theologian of the West, discusses the difference here between the Western and Third World. The necessary revolution, he argues, can only take place in the West. This is not to belittle the Third World, but Ellul wishes to strike at the root of the problems, and these roots are in Western civilization. Ellul writes that the revolution will require sacrifice, not of lives, but of efficiency. A revolution against the technological society, not just technology, implies decreased efficiency in all areas: total yield, productivity, adaptiveness, and integration, a lowered standard of living, the reduction of large-scale public programs, and the erosion of a mass culture. Ellul warns if we are unwilling to pay the combined price of those four reductions, then we are not ready for revolution. In Violence, Ellul rejects Christian compromise with violence and the notion that Christians can use violence, including violence for revolutionary ends. He believes that the ends and means of the revolution must be consistent, and that rules out any violence in the revolutionary process. And I reach my conclusion, hopefully I have time. What relevance does Ellul's revolutionary Christianity have today? Several people have tried to assess Ellul's relevance, although the secondary literature is not very voluminous. David Gill writes that Ellul's influence on our practice and understanding of violence has been minimal, but that Ellul deserves a renewed hearing in the 21st century. In my own assessment, he is well worth reading. I think that Ellul gets it right in his insistence that we struggle against technology, the state, and propaganda. The state remains relevant even in the age of globalised capitalism. And he says that every revolution seems to reinforce the power of the state. When we think we have a revolution, often it's just reinforcing parts of the problem. Propaganda, he says, is also a forceful extension of the force of the state. It has become psychological force or violence. It is violent, according to Ellul, because it violates the masses and wishes to coerce the actions of citizens en masse. And propaganda cannot be part of any Christian revolution and must be fought against. But despite my agreements with Ellul, there are some reasons for thinking that Ellul won't get much of a hearing today. Firstly, the Western world is now less Christian than it was 50 years ago. And while some might celebrate this decline of religious observance as something that will cure the world of religious violence, Ellul would say that the world is still religious but less Christian. And this change would appear to reduce the number of Christians who can make the necessary revolution. But Ellul would say that it's only nominal Christians who have left the church, and that those who remain can still make the revolution. Secondly, the world is a very different place now. The apparent technological, economic and political leadership in the West is in abeyance. Ellul's necessary revolution in the West did not come before the global power shift, which is relocating power to the East, with Japan, South Korea and now China taking a lead in technological advancement, with other countries perfecting the development of status politics and propaganda techniques. However, the West still leads in advocating for individual freedoms, which provides the necessary space for the development of the human personality. Third, the ecological crisis, well known to Ellul, has developed beyond what he knew at the time. While some might say that Ellul's style of revolution would attack the root causes of the ecological crisis we face, many people are still at the level of superficial analysis and would not make these connections. Furthermore, Ellul would not be surprised that many, if not most, of the solutions to climate change are technological. Electric cars, wind turbines, geoengineering, carbon trading schemes are all in line with the technological society against which the revolution is necessary. Fourth, Ellul offers no blueprint for which revolutionaries will be fighting. What, people might ask, is this revolution for? What is the society we are fighting for? Now, Ellul would consider such questions a betrayal of revolutionary thinking. They fit within a technological ethos and a kind of cause and effect thinking. This action will result in this outcome. The results of an Ellulian revolution will be unscripted, and the result of free people acting in free ways and developing a free society as they go. And Ellul never expected this call to individual responsibility to be popular, but nevertheless he thought it necessary all the same. In conclusion then, I believe that Ellul's diagnosis of society has been shown to be largely accurate. The technological age is continuing as he predicted, yet people are not ready for his solution and perhaps never will be. People will continue to favour violent revolt over rational, non-violent revolution. Thank you.